it's a testing.
Mhm.
It's a testing of your faith, and if you don't obey to what God is calling you to in this season, he is not going to provide like he said that he would. Like, it was a testing as far as the manna is concerned. Like, he gave them just enough for what they needed for that particular day. You know what I mean? And when they hoarded and took more than what they needed, the manna turned, and it became moldy and worm infested and all of these things. Like, it melted in the sun. Like, when we take more than what we need, is it obedience? Are we actually trusting God, obeying God when we have all of these different safety nets set up?
In Exodus 16,
Yeah.
the Lord gave the Israelites manna from heaven and told them to gather just what they needed for the day. And um, and when they didn't listen to the Lord and to Moses, and they tried gathering up some of it to hoard it more than what they needed for the day, then that manna turned into, or like it got worms and stuff in it. Um, and so God is like making it clear, I'm going to provide for you every day just what you need for the day. And you don't need to hoard it because, like you were saying, it's such a good point that when we try to when the Israelites tried to hoard, they were trying to make sure that they were safe and secure, that they had food, and they were trying to do that for themselves, even though God said, I will provide.
Come on.
And so when we in our lives like hoard things to provide for our own safety or security, we're not trusting in the Lord. And when, like you said, um when we try to make a backup plan to make sure that we're going to be okay, again, we're not trusting the Lord, and we're not being obedient to what he's told us in the Bible, which in this story and later in the New Testament, when Jesus tells us to pray, Lord, give us this day our daily bread. And again, when he says in Matthew 6, 36, do not be anxious for today, for
Come
tomorrow.
on.
Tomorrow will be anxious for itself.
That's good.
Sufficient for the day is its own trouble. He's telling us repeatedly in different places in the Bible that we need to trust him just with what, just for the day,
Yeah.
to borrow
Yeah.
worry from tomorrow, not to try to provide for ourselves for tomorrow, but for today, to be, to trust him every day. It's like
Yeah.
it's a challenge to us to walk in obedience and trust and faith in him every single day. Um,
Yeah.
and when we do, he is faithful and he always provides.
Come on. He
And
always provides. Yes.
but on the flip side, he won't provide if we're not walking in the obedience. Like, he blesses the
Ooh,
obedience. He
good.
doesn't bless it when we choose to try to do it on our own, because he didn't create us to do all this on our own, right?
That's
He
so good.
created us for relationship with him. And so it's not only a challenge to us, but it's like, I want to bless you. You just need to choose to walk with me every day, to choose
Mm.
obedience every day, to choose to trust me every day.
Welcome to another episode of Hey Girl Radio. We are your hosts for the season. My name is Alexis Unique, and I have my girl Jessica Ann on. Say hey, Jess.
Hey.
So we are in the season Butterfly Besties. The Butterfly Bestie season, we are talking about obedience, and today is our second episode of the series. And honey, let me just tell you something. It is a good one, okay? Not because everybody goes through, their own obedience journey, and like this is what the body of Christ needs to hear right now, and it probably is. You know what I mean? Because we're being led by God to actually talk about this right now. So this might be the season for it. But the reason why I say that is because this is the season for our individual lives. Like we're not just talking about something that we read. Like this is something that we are talking about not only because it's we're led to talk about it, but because we are currently in this season in our own individual lives, and we find ourselves as we are discussing amongst ourselves, like just communicating as besties, we have this conversation about obedience, and it all just like circles back to
Mhm.
obedience. So we know that it's nothing but the Lord. So we praise God and we thank him for talking to us and through us in this series, and we just hope that you are blessed just as much as it's been blessing us in our own individual lives. And if God will lead us, we will share our own individual stories as he has led us or sees fit. But let me just tell you something, like, if anybody knows when God leads you to do something, he will not just lead you to talk about something before he takes you through it. So this is our taking through of obedience. So today's episode, we are talking about how obedience does not have to be perfect. Listen, if you did not listen to the last episode, let me just encourage you. You got to go back and listen to the last episode, because in the last episode, we discussed the three steps to obedience, or the three don'ts to obedience, is what I would like to call them. The first couple of things we said was don't play the blame game, don't worry about what others will think, including yourself, and don't go the right way, go God's way.
Mhm.
Right? And bonus tip Jess gave us at the end was don't be afraid of your limitations. Why? Because God already knows who you are. God created you hair by hair, limb by limb. Like he knew who you were in your mother's womb. He knew that you would make that mistake before you even made it, and he still called you. So don't be afraid of your limitations. Go to God with your fears, go to God with your doubts, and know that obedience does not have to be perfect. We will talk about the things that we feel like obedience needs to be, but perfection is not one of them. So, in today's episode, we just wanted to talk about this a little bit because we were chatting in our own personal conversation, and Jess was really giving some good insight of her Bible study on Father Abraham.
Mhm.
And it really just tickled me pink because it was something that I had not even thought about, not even actually put two and two together. But when she broke it down and gave me the revelation that God had given her during this time, it really made a lot of sense. And I felt like a lot of people needed to hear it because um people are going through what they're going through each and every day. You know what I mean? Like there's an obedience journey in every Christian's life. And honestly, in every non-Christian's life, whether they know it or not, like it's an obedience journey.
Mhm.
And to know that you don't have to be perfect in being obedient takes a lot of the pressure off. You know what I mean? So
Mhm.
I wanted to just create a platform where we can kind of talk freely and effortlessly about what God is revealing in our lives and how that ties into the obedience plays.
So I was sharing with Alexis recently um, that I had just been reading in Genesis about the story of Abraham, and in Genesis, when we first start hearing about Abraham, we hear how he how the Lord spoke to him and told him to leave his father's land, leave the place where he grew up and where all of his family lived, and to go. And the Lord gives him very few details, doesn't say much about um, where he's going. He just says, go. And Abraham is immediately obedient and does what God says.
Immediately.
Immediately. He gets up.
Like, that's a whole word in itself.
Yeah, he takes his wife and his stuff and he leaves, not knowing where he's going to go. And so a few times we see this where God says to Abraham to do something and he does it immediately.
Mhm.
Um and then we also see that in the part of the story about Abraham that most people know is that God gave Abraham a promise that he would make his descendants as numerous as the stars or the sand on the seashore.
Mhm.
And uh, and so and Abraham believed God. He
Come
believed
on. He
that
believed. He
he
believed.
believed he believed God, believed that what he said would happen, which is actually crazy because he was already at this point super old and him and his wife had never had any children. And so, how in the
Right.
world are you going to make my descendants as numerous as the stars when I don't yet have one?
Exactly.
And so, because of this, continued faith and belief in that what God said he would do, no matter what his circumstances looked like, Abraham ended up in what we call the Hall of Faith.
Mhm.
Um, in is that the one in Romans or the one in Hebrews? I think it's
That's in
Hebrews.
Hebrews. Yeah.
Yeah, Hebrews 11, the Hall of Faith. And so, um, so when we think of Abraham, we think of him as like the father of many nations, the this man of faith who his belief in God was counted to him as righteousness.
Hmm.
Um,
Because I mean, because like let's not forget, Abraham is the same guy that God was like, "Oh yeah, I'm gonna give you, you're gonna be a father of many nations. I'm gonna give you all of these children, so on and so forth. But yeah, I want you to go and sacrifice the one child that I just gave you that was like your firstborn."
mhm,
And he
yeah,
did it. And he and
and he
like
did.
and he did it.
Right. God was like, "I'm going to give you your first descendant of your own flesh and blood, of you and Sarah's own flesh and blood, to become the father of many nations, and this beautiful promise that's finally going to be fulfilled.
Hmm.
Now I want you to go kill your son."
Yeah.
And he does it. He again, like he's done throughout the story, is just immediately obedient, even though he can't see what this looks like,
Hmm.
how God's going to make it happen. Um, and so, but the point that I was making to Alexis is, despite him being like the father of faith, um, when God um, tells him again, comes to him as three men in the wilderness, that he invites into his home, and God says that he's going to give him a son through Sarah. He laughs at God.
He laughs.
He laughs.
Like straight up laughs.
Yeah, like this is the father of faith, the one who's like been believing God this whole time, and then he's like,
Hmm.
"That's funny. Yeah,
Hmm.
sure."
Right. Like, okay, I'll believe it when I see it. I don't know what he said. I'm just making stuff up. Like, but he laughed.
Mm-hmm. Um, and so, and then another example before I make this point is that um, when God also tells him to, uh, well, I have two examples. When God tells Abraham to leave his family and go wherever God tells him to go, eventually to the land of Canaan, um, God says, leave your family behind and go. Um, so I think that meant like, take your wife and your stuff and leave. So his wife was included in you can go with Abraham
But
because
he
it's
took
his wife.
Lot.
But Lot was not.
He took
He
Lot.
took he took his nephew Lot when
Mhm,
God said to leave your family behind.
mhm.
And so this is like a moment of like Abraham's doing immediately obeying what God said to do by going, but at the same time not being fully obedient by taking one of his family members with him.
Mhm.
Um, and
Which
then
created a whole thing, and, like, he had to come back and save him, and it was a whole thing. Like, read your Bible, it is good because the details are impeccable.
right. So if Abraham had obeyed God fully the first time, then then he wouldn't have had all these issues with Lot that he had later on. And then another point is when Abraham twice he runs into a ruler, into a city or a people who was greater than he was, and he lies to them saying that Sarah is his sister, not his
Oh,
wife.
yeah, I forgot about that.
And through this he's like trying to protect himself instead of allowing the Lord to protect him. And because he does it twice, he's like not learning his lesson from the first time. And so my point though is that this man of faith, um who goes down in history as someone we're supposed to admire as like the father of faith, the father of many nations. He is God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Mhm.
And yet this man who had so much faith that it was counted to him as righteousness, who obeyed God immediately so many times, did not obey perfectly.
Come on.
Time and time again, there are examples of his imperfect obedience,
Mhm.
whether it was not being fully obedient, whether it was being flat out disobedient, by uh, telling the ruler that Sarah was his wife or his sister, not his wife, or obedience um, after the fact, after laughing in God's
Mhm.
face and and doubting him, you know?
Mm.
So um so this person who we're supposed to admire, um or who maybe we're not supposed to admire, but we're supposed to see ourselves in him, and see that even someone who went down in the hall of faith in the Bible,
Mhm.
who like we're supposed to see ourselves in him and see that because we are human, because we have limitations, we will not always be perfectly obedient. And that is okay.
Mhm.
And God
Mhm.
uses it despite our imperfections, despite our doubt,
Mhm.
despite the limitations that we have as humans.
Yeah. That's so good. That's so good. And it's like we have to make sure now it's a thin line between love and hate because when we talk about, you don't have to be perfect. I don't want you to go in here and think, oh, well, I didn't obey God today, so he'll forgive me. And like that's abusing God's grace. You know what I mean? Like that's abusing the grace that God has given you, the mercy that he's giving you, like all of the things. Like, let's not get that confused because God said in his word that when you are led by the Spirit, you have the power to overcome your fleshly desires. You know what I mean? Like that's in Romans 8. So when we talking about not being perfect, we're not talking about intentional disobedience.
Mhm.
Like, let's just put that out there. We're talking about trying to obey, doing everything that you can to obey, but coming into this roadblock of a limitation that your human flesh puts up, and like you don't really have any control. You know what I mean? Like we have to be very mindful of intentionally being disobedient versus trying to surrender all, trying to obey what God is telling you to, and then, like, you're running into doubt, you're running into fear, you're running into laughter, which could have been doubt in Abraham's mind, or it could have been, something else where God is just like, Abraham was just like, ha ha, it's happening. Like, I don't know. We don't know. Like,
Yeah.
but we do know the Bible says that he laughed. Not only did he laugh, but his wife laughed. You know what I mean? So,
Mhm.
like, what is the laughter about? Like, are you laughing not to cry? Like, are you laughing, because you're doubting? Are you laughing because, you're just so excited that it's finally happening? Because, it says here in Romans 4:19, it says, and not being weak in faith, he, talking about Abraham, he did not consider his own body already dead since he was about 100 years old, and the deadness of Sarah's womb.
Mhm.
He was 100 years old having a baby. Like, if God told you that you're about to have a baby in your own flesh and room, you would probably laugh too. You know what I mean? Like,
Mhm.
let's be honest. Like, you're human. And God recognizes that and recognizes your limitations and says, hey, just because you are human and have limitations does not mean that I am not going to bless you. He still
Mhm.
blessed Abraham. He still gave him the promise. He still, you know what I mean, provided for him when he told him that he was going to provide. Like, even though Abraham brought Lot alone on the journey, he still provided, he still led him, he still showed him where he needed to be and how even though he lied to Obadi and told Obadi that, Sarah was his sister instead of his wife, like God still provided for him and still got him out of that situation, and still saved him because he knew his heart. God says in his word, like, we go after looks and appearances, but God comes after the heart. He looks after the heart. Like, what is in your heart? You know? How are you going to obey? So, when we talk about obedience, yes, it does not have to be perfect, but there are a few things that we think, it does have to be. And so, as we were planning for this podcast, we came up with a quick little list that we want to go down. And I mean, quick depending on, quick is subjective. Like, is it quick? Is it not quick? But we're going to talk about, we're going to be led in how God is leading us to have this conversation. So if you are on an obedience journey and this is for you, honey, listen in. If you know somebody who you can actually send this to or is going through a journey in their life where it requires obedience, send this to them. Share it with the next woman or the next girl or save it for yourself because at the end of the day, God is actually showing us how to be obedient. And the reason, like, let's just back up just a little bit because when we're talking about obedience, it's really one of the pillars of our Christian journey.
Mhm.
Like, let's just be honest. It's a pillar of that's why obedience is why we're talking about obedience because it's important. It's one of the pillars of our Christian journey. If we think about it, disobedience was the first sin.
Mhm.
Like when we talk about Adam and Eve in the garden and all of the things, like the first sin, the reason why they got kicked out of the garden was because of Eve's disobedience. She did not obey what God had said, period.
Yep.
Like it wasn't about eating the fruit. It wasn't about, you know what I mean, hiding, sewing fig leaves together because you were naked in the garden. Like it was about the fact that God said, don't eat the fruit, and you ate the fruit.
Mhm.
What is it in what is it in your life that God is telling you not to do, but you do it anyway? Just like the Israelites, you know what I mean? Like when they were in the wilderness, God told them not to hoard manna for the next day. They did. What happened? It turned into worms. It melted into the sun. It is about obedience. It is about having faith enough to recognize and to believe that God is who he says he is and he will do what he says he will do. I got that from Veggie Tales, by the way.
Mhm.
God is who he says he is, and he will do what he says he will do. And the fact that you are acting on that, that is obedience, you know? So if obedience doesn't have to be perfect, we feel like it must be surrendering. Tell me more about that, Jess. Why do you feel that way?
Yeah, so um so God created us to be in relationship with him. And so even though we're not going to um obey perfectly every time because we're human, because we have limitations, because we don't have the same understanding that God does, because God is outside of time and space and he knows everything. Um, because of our limitations as humans, we won't do everything perfectly every time. We're not going to obey perfectly every time. But so then, because of that, because we are imperfect humans, how do we then be obedient?
Mhm.
If it's just like a fact that we're not going to do it right every time, how do I be obedient? And the biggest uh answer to that question is thinking of, what did God create us for? Why
Mm.
did he create us? Because if he didn't create us perfectly, right? If he gave us free will and instead of making us robots that did what God wanted us to do every time without question, because he gave us free will, um, he also created us to be in relationship with him. And so uh, to be obedient, we need to surrender to him, acknowledge our limitations, acknowledge that we need him, and surrender um, to his presence, to his guiding, to his leading. Because, and this ties into our other point about being led by the Spirit.
Yeah.
Um, but um, but when we don't know what to do, when we don't know how to be obedient, we need to come to that place of recognizing that we're human and that we need God because he created us that way,
Mhm.
and surrendering to him and to his will. Giving God everything,
Mm.
everything that you are, everything you have, all that's in your heart, and choosing his will over yours, saying,
Okay.
I'm giving up, like, I can't do this by myself.
Mm.
And because you didn't make me to do it by myself. And so I am surrendering my free will to you and choosing with my free will
Come
to
on.
choose your will. Um, and the way that we do that, the way that we choose his will over our own, is to come to a place of surrender, of saying, everything I am, everything I have is yours, God. So show me what to do. Show me what's your will. And to me, that's surrender.
I love that. I love that because when you said surrendering your rights to do it on your own and giving it to God, like that's it. That's it because and it takes humility.
Mm-hmm.
Like you said, realizing I cannot do this on my own. Like I can't. You call me to do something, and honestly, I can't do it by myself. So if you want me to do this, you're going to have to help me, like at the end of the day, because, that's what surrender is, realizing that you can't do it by yourself. He did not make you to do it by yourself. He's giving you a cheat code, and his name is Jesus. Use it. You know what I mean? Like, use your cheat code, bro. Stop trying to go to level 7 without using the cheat code. Like he gave you the cheat code for a reason. Why are you trying to do it the hard way? Just surrender and be obedient to what God is telling you. And the reason why I had to pull out this other Bible is because I was reading this when I'm reading First and Second Samuel, and that was a lot of what David did. Like you will see time after time, before doing something, David will actually ask God if he should do it. You know what I mean? Like, whether it was through Enoch or whether it was through a priest or whatever it was, or prophet. Like, for an example, in Second Samuel 2, David had heard like Saul and Jonathan had died. And so now David is trying to figure out what his next move is. Just like you were saying, just like, what do you want me to do? What is my next move? And it says, after this, David asked the Lord, should I move back to one of the towns of Judah? Let me read that again. After this, David asked the Lord, don't ask your mama, don't ask your
Mhm.
auntie, don't ask your grandma and them, like ask the Lord, like not even your mentor. You know what I mean? Like, what does God want you to do? David asked the Lord, should I move back to one of the towns in Judah? He's asking God if he should move. How many times do we feel like, oh, I'm gonna go to a new city, I'm gonna go to a new state, I'm gonna do this, I got a job up in here? Like, okay, but did you ask God?
Mhm.
Is that God's plan for you? Like, even a little thing, somebody thinks that that would be little, like a little thing as moving to another town, another city, another location. Like, God has you in that particular location for a reason. God is calling you to that particular location for a reason. Did God tell you to? If you don't know, ask him. David asked the Lord, should I move back to one of the towns in Judah? Yes, the Lord replied. Then David asked, what town should I go to? Bro, be specific. Like, David asked, he was in the asking God business. Like, he asked the Lord about everything. Even sometimes when he was like trying to figure out if I remember one time, like I said, I think this was in First Samuel when David's wife had gotten kidnapped. Like, he had two wives, that's beside the story. Ask God. I don't know. But his both of his wives got kidnapped, and like he before he pursued them, please hear me. His wives got kidnapped. Before he pursued, he asked God, God, do you want me to pursue the Amalek? Am I going to, are they going to overtake me or am I going to overcome them? He not only did he ask them if he wanted them to pursue, he asked what the outcome was going to be.
Mhm.
Obedience does not have to be perfect, but it has to be surrendering. If you know you can't do it by yourself, ask God, surrender to God. Um, um, be humble enough to know that this is beyond your will and you need God to help you with this.
Yeah.
Ask him.
Mhm. That's good.
That's so powerful. I was reading that and I was just like, dang, David was asking God about everything. Like,
Mhm.
even the time where Saul had came up against him and he had him surrounded in the city, like he asked him, like, God, is Saul gonna overtake me? Like he asked, David was in the asking God business. You talk about surrender. Yes, David was surrendering because, like you said, it first starts with surrender. Like God has a plan to right our wrongs, and He did not create us to do this thing alone.
Mhm.
But it starts with surrender. I think Romans 8:28 talks about how, everything works out for the good of those who loves him and it has a plan according to his will. Like even if you are wrong in, obeying God, even if you are not perfect in every which way in how to obey God, he will right your wrongs and everything will work out for the good of those who love him
Mhm.
if you surrender.
Mhm.
So that's number 1. Surrendering or obedience does not have to be perfect, but it has to be surrendering. Number 2, obedience does not have to be perfect, but it has to be faithful.
Mhm.
So, the reason why we brought this up is because we have to realize that in obeying God, He's going to test you.
Mhm.
And it's a question of just like he touched the Israelites with the manna, it's a question of, are you going to trust him? Like when you think of faithful, Jess, like how do you continue to be faithful in obedience? Like what does that look like?
Yeah. Well, I was thinking about how we're talking about how obedience doesn't need to be perfect. So, so being faithful is like even if we like fail in a sense, if we don't obey the first time, to continue to be faithful to trying to obey, like to not allow um, the enemy to speak that lie into your mind that because I failed this time, like, and I failed next time, I'm never going to get it right. Right.
Mm,
And when the enemy tries to speak that, lie to you to remember to that you can't do this on your own, to go back to the surrender, the first thing that we need to do, to recognize our need for him and surrender to his will for our life. And then from that place, from knowing that it's not, from not trying to do it out of our own will or do it on our own, knowing that
mm,
he's doing it with us, we can know, we can be encouraged to continue to be faithful, to trying to be obedient, to do, whatever he tells us to do when he tells us to do it.
mhm. Yeah. I mean, think about Job. Like this, you talk about a guy that had to be faithful.
Mm,
He didn't do nothing in God's eyes, but God wanted to test him. He wanted to test his faith. Is he going to continue to trust? His wife even told him, "Why don't you just curse God and die?" And that was nothing but from the enemy.
mm,
Like, let's just be honest, because the enemy came to God and was like, "Yo, I'm gonna test your boy Joe because you don't let nothing happen to him." And God was like, "Yeah, you can do whatever you need to, but don't take his life."
yeah,
God allowed the sifting of his faith to confirm, is he going to be faithful or not?
yeah.
He had his kids taken away from him. I think, did his wife die or not? I'm not sure. I don't think his wife died.
I don't think so in the end.
He had like all of these skin boils and all of
Mhm,
these things, like he had his riches taken away from him, like all of these things the enemy took away from him, but he decided to continue to be faithful. He
mhm,
surrendered and he talked to God about it. He cried out about it to God in a whole lot of chapters, and
mhm,
God answered in a whole lot of chapters too. Like, if y'all want a good story, honey, God put him in his place. Okay, like you need to read the book of Job. But faithfulness. We have to continue to be faithful. And how do you be faithful? You got to be spirit led. You
mhm,
got to be spirit, because going back to the first point, and this is why it's so important that you have to surrender. You cannot be obedient without surrendering. You
mhm,
cannot be faithful without surrendering. You cannot be spirit led without surrendering. Like, you've got to surrender to the Holy Spirit. You've got to surrender to God, and God will lead you in what He is calling you to. And the
mhm,
reason why we said obedience has to be spirit led is because goes back to our point when we were saying in the last episode, don't go the right way, go God's way.
mhm,
So many times in our life where we think that, you know what I mean, like we can just go and do something that we know is right, but God didn't call you to that place. He called you to this place. He called you to go left, and you're going right.
mhm.
You got to be spirit led.
Yeah. And and I just want to throw this point out there because this is what the Lord's teaching me right now in this season, that sometimes we can get paralyzed or stuck in fear when
Oh,
we are trying to be spirit led. We're afraid to do something if we're not sure whether he's called us to do it or not. And so one thing that the Lord has been teaching me is like, he's like, how am I supposed to direct your steps, and tell you to turn to the right or to the left if you're not walking? Um,
that's so
so
good.
don't be paralyzed by fear, um, but trust him, continue to surrender to him, and keep walking forward, trusting, believing that he will direct your steps.
That's so good. That is so good. How can I tell you to go to the left or to the right if you're not walking?
Mhm,
Like, don't let fear paralyze you. Don't let doubt paralyze you. Don't let your insecurities paralyze you. Don't let the fact that you don't feel qualified paralyze you. God told you to write the book. He didn't ask you to get the degree in writing.
mhm,
He didn't ask you to get the degree in English. Like he told you to write the book. You know what I mean? Like,
mhm,
um, it's so wild because when it talks about being spirit led, I'm trying to look up the scripture where it talks about being led by the flesh versus being led by the spirit.
Mhm.
It says here in Romans 8 and 5, for those who live according to the flesh set their minds on things of the flesh, but those who live according to the Spirit, the things of the Spirit. For to be carnal minded is death, but to be spiritually minded is life and peace. So it's like when you surrender, God will give you a whole new mind. When you surrender, fully surrender to God, he renews your mind in a way that you are being spirit led, in a way that you live according to the spirit, the things of the spirit, not to the flesh. Now, remember, when we talk about this being spirit led, and when we talk about, going the right way versus God's way, we're not talking about abusing God's grace.
Mhm.
So being spirit led is recognizing that you are not a slave of your sin anymore, but you are actually being led by the Holy Spirit, by God's Spirit, and He's giving you the power.
Mhm.
Power giving to you through the Spirit, not by might.
Mhm.
So it reminds me of a time where I tried to clean up my own act um, by myself, by might, right?
Mhm.
As we're on the subject of being spirit led, like let me just give you an example so that you can know what I mean by this. Like I remember before I fully surrendered to God and I was like, you know what? Like I need to get right. I need to get right. I need to do right. Like, I'm going to stop smoking weed. I'm going to stop smoking weed. I'm going to, take the weed that I just bought, untie it, dump it into the trash bag, without a Ziploc bag, just dump it into the bag. I'm quitting cold turkey. Like, I'm done.
Mhm.
When I tell you an hour later, I was in that trash bag finding little buds of weed that I can roll up and smoke. And I did, ketchup and all. Like, I don't care. Because why? Because I wasn't led by the Spirit. I was trying to do it on my own might. It's
Mhm.
like trying to clean house before the maid arrives.
Mhm.
Like, why did you hire a maid if you are going to clean your own house? In the same way, when I fully surrendered to God, I remember being on the floor of this bedroom that I'm sitting in right now, and I was like, God, I'm done. I can't do this by myself. Just like Jess said earlier, I cannot do it by myself. I can't do it alone. I can't do this by myself. I need you. I know you don't want me to smoke weed anymore. I know you don't want me to, have sex anymore. I know you don't want me to drink alcohol anymore. I know that there's a things in my life that you don't want me to do anymore, but I can't stop it.
Mhm.
If you don't want me to do it anymore, take the desires away from me. I promise you that was my heart. I promise you that was my prayer. I promise you that's what I said to God. I was like, God, I can't do it alone. I fully surrender. I was tears, crying, snotting, everything, like in a pool of my own tears. But I
Mhm.
was serious. I had decided I was tired of being sick and tired of being sick and tired. And,
Mhm.
I asked God to take the desires away from me. When I tell you the next day, I did not have a desire like that from that day on. No desires to smoke weed, no desires to have sex, no desires to, drink alcohol, like none of that. Not the cussing stopped. Everything that God didn't want me to do has stopped. Cold
Mhm.
turkey, not because of me. I had already tried it because of me. I'm telling you this from experience. I already tried it my way. So I know it wasn't me. I know it was the Spirit of God. And that's what it's going to take for you to be obedient. That's what's going to take for me to be obedient. That's what's going to take for Jess to be obedient, to be Spirit led, to be led by the Spirit, to fully surrender and give it all to God. Because when you do that, He will give you power to
Mhm.
overcome your fleshly desires.
Yeah, that's good. I love how it ties back into like your testimony is like surrender. Come to a place where you realize you can't do it on your own. Acknowledge that you need him, surrender to him. And then after that you were faithful. Um Once the Lord started to take away those things, then you came to this place of being fully surrendered to the Lord. and were faithful to begin to do what God told you to do. And did you do it perfectly every time after that point? No, but you continue to be faithful to doing what you felt like the Lord was telling you to do. And then, and in the midst of that, also trying to be faithful to be led by the Spirit, um, and doing only what He has told you to do instead of doing it on your own strength. And you and I still don't do this perfectly every time, but I love how your testimony is just like surrender and be faithful and be Spirit led.
It was perfect in the way that God took the desires away from me, and I didn't have the desire to do it anymore. So I didn't even want to do it. I didn't I was faithful in the way of deleting my old contacts. I was faithful in the way of, separating myself from, people who still smoked weed and I didn't. Like that's the faithfulness that we're talking about here. I was spirit led and I had the power to be able to overcome those fleshly desires because I asked God for it. I asked God to take the desires away from me. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that leads us into our last point. So when we talk about point number 4, it's like, okay, obedience doesn't have to be perfect, but it has to be persistent.
Mhm.
Like, what does persistent mean, Jess?
Um, Persistent is, um, you could say it's similar to being faithful in that you like keep trying to do what God's called you to do. But I think a bit more similar to like perseverance, where it's like no matter what um you go through,
Mm,
you're still faithful, you still try to be obedient. Because when we talk about persistence, we're talking about like or perseverance, um, like when, you know, obedience doesn't have to be perfect, but we need to continue to persevere in faith, even when um, our circumstances are really challenging. So it makes me think of the story of Joseph,
mm,
who was one of the second youngest of his 12 brothers, the sons of Jacob, or Israel, as he was later called. And his brothers hated him, and they basically like kidnapped him and then sold him into slavery. And so this crazy story of him like getting sold into slavery and then becoming a slave in Egypt. um he goes through, after being sold to Potiphar
yep.
in Egypt. He works hard and becomes like the head of all of Potiphar's household, until Potiphar's wife tries to like make a move on him,
Yes.
and then blames him for the encounter, and so Potiphar like throws him in jail. And then
Mhm.
he's in jail for however long, at least more than like 2 years, um, because he like interprets a dream for a cupbearer, and then it's 2 years after that, but the Bible tells us that he finally gets out. But in the prison, then he's also faithful um, to do whatever God's called him to do, and God gives him favor even in the prison, so that he also becomes like head of the prison.
Come on.
Um, and so then finally, when the cupbearer remembers him and he gets released, and goes and interprets Pharaoh's dream, then Pharaoh ends up making him also head over all of Egypt, only second to Pharaoh.
Mm,
Um, and so that's like a quick summary of like the story of Joseph. The but he oh, and then, well, the end of his story is in once he's the ruler of Egypt and he interprets Pharaoh's dream. The dream is a warning that there's going to be 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of famine. And
mhm,
so Joseph becomes the ruler and stores up food during the 7 years of plenty to have enough in during the 7 years of famine. And so then Joseph's family, who he gets separated from and has been and is separated from for 20 years. um they end up running out of food where they live, and they come to Egypt searching for food, and his brothers, who are the ones who sold him into slavery, who hated
Mm,
him and kidnapped him and sold him, show up in front of him asking for food, and they don't recognize him because he looked like an Egyptian now. But and so then there's this crazy story of how they're reunited, and Joseph is able to forgive and to recognize God's goodness through like the worst possible things that happened to him, and recognize that God planned all of that. What they intended for evil, he planned for good, that he would save all of Egypt and all of his family as well. And so, but this point about like persevering even in the midst of your circumstances, like talk about hard circumstances.
yes.
Um, and Joseph was still somehow like faithful to the Lord and believed the Lord and trusted in him to be the one to interpret dreams, even though he was like sold as a slave,
Mm-hmm.
like
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure there's lots of people, and I'll admit to doing it too. When we like run into a circumstance it seems really terrible, we start to question like God, and question like, how could you do this to me? I thought you were good, I thought you were faithful. And like Joseph didn't do that. he
Mm-hmm.
but he trusted God even in like the worst circumstances. um and like similar to that, I see my own life and my own response, which was not as faithful as Joseph's was at the time, where, for me, um, there came a point when um, I got in a car accident with my whole family, like
Mm-hmm.
every one of my immediate family members, my mom and my dad and my three brothers and me and a friend of mine were all in a car, and we got like T-boned, and it was a pretty bad accident. um but um but the Lord like used that very circumstance to begin to teach me how to trust in him. And in the moment I didn't understand that, and so I questioned the Lord and was like, I thought that you would protect me, like, because I've loved you my whole life. I've known you, and I know that you are a good God and that you protect and have protected me my whole life up till now. So like, why didn't you protect me now? And so I started really to question him, and it was kind of like a moment of um uh like breaking trust in that relationship. But it was through the way that I interpreted what happened, not because God wasn't faithful, because the reality of that story is that when we got T-boned, we like the car went in the air and tipped on its side and skidded all the way across the intersection,
Wow.
and broke my window in the back, broke my dad's window in the front. um and the other side of the car that didn't land on the asphalt was like so smashed in, you could see like it did so much damage. Every single person in that car,
Come
my whole
on.
family and my friend, barely scratched. Barely.
What?
The worst injury, yeah, the worst injury was my dad. um he braced himself when the window broke, and he ended up getting like asphalt and glass in his arm. But it was just like, like scrapes and abrasions from the glass and the asphalt. That was the worst injury. The rest of us, like a little abrasion from the seatbelt. That was it.
Listen, I am like flabbergasted every time I hear this story because I like the fact that that crash was so bad.
Mhm. And I forgot the best part of like my own personal testimony of this was like my window broke, right? And I had taken off my flip-flops in the car because it was like the middle of summer. Um and when I crawled myself out through the trunk to get out of our car that was flipped over on its side, I didn't get a single cut from the glass, like not a scratch from the glass.
Wow.
So talk about like God's faithfulness in the midst of bad circumstances.
Wow.
Yeah,
But you are persistent. You are persistent to continue to follow God, even when you question, God, why did you let this happen to me?
right, exactly. And so what happened after that is a like an even bigger part of my testimony, honestly, than the car accident. That I continued. So the next year, I got in another car accident that was minor, but it was another accident. Next year, I got another one, and a little bit later, there was one more after that, and um, and it built up this like uh, you know, these it like left me questioning, his faithfulness. And but I chose still in the midst of that somehow to it's like I still believed in God. I still had faith in him, and I knew that he was good. And so I was still questioning and not sure, um you know like why he would allow me to go through those things. And then at the same time, I had a really bad experience with some relationships ending in my life, both my boyfriend at the time and my best friend. And those relationships, like, just sort of coming crashing down around me at the same time that all this car accident stuff was happening. And so it's just sort of like, for me, like one thing after the other, kind of like Joseph with being sold and then being put in prison, you know, and it was just, I'm sure it felt to him like one thing after the other. And it was just like, why, God? Like, why would you let me go through these things?
Mm.
And eventually, years later, when someone was like praying for me, the Lord spoke to me through this other person, um, and helped me. And the Lord like told me, she helped me see, this friend of mine helped me see that God was saying that it was actually an honor and a privilege that I gave you for you to walk through those things, because it was a test. It was a testing of your faith. And and so bringing it back to like the faithfulness and the surrendering to God, being spirit led and being and persevering, all of those things, it was like I I tried to be obedient as best as I could in the midst of all of these circumstances that were making me have so many questions, and making me doubt that God was fully good because he didn't protect me, and why didn't he. And so in the midst of those questions and those doubt, I continued to try to be obedient to him. And and in doing so, I was choosing God, choosing faith, choosing um, relationship with him time and time again, even in the midst of my questioning. And that whole experience brought me to like the other side of that. Now my relationship with God is so much deeper because of those things that I walked through. I like so much more deeply believe, because I know from my experience that he's good in the midst of the worst of circumstances. And so it was an honor and a privilege for me. Like I'm beyond grateful for those experiences that were like the hardest of my life so far, because of where they brought me to now, because of the faith that I have in him now, because of the relationship I have with him now. Um, it was absolutely an honor and a privilege to walk through those experiences. And I don't know about Joseph, but whether he would call it an honor and a privilege, but he certainly was like praising God for being the one to bring him into slavery for the sake of saving so many lives. Like, so many people would have perished without Joseph, and he recognized that and praised God and thanked him for bringing him through these circumstances. No matter what you're going through, no matter what season you're in right now, to continue to surrender to God, to be faithful, to be led by his Spirit, and to be persistent and persevere, because he is good and he is good to you. So, yeah.
So, hey, girl. Bye, girl. And we will catch you on the next episode. Talk to you soon. Bye.
Bye.